The federal government has announced new funding to help asylum claimants in need of housing. Hundreds of refugee and asylum seekers have been living on the streets of Toronto, with thousands more relying on the city's shelter system for a place to stay. Today, the federal government announced a one-time injection of $212 million to help with housing, including $97 million in new funding for the City of Toronto alone. But some of those affected say this money won't solve the problem. Sean Fraser is the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Minister, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you as always.
You've put $97 million here on the table to help the City of Toronto deal with refugee housing, but it's requested $157 million. How do you explain that gap?
Look, this is really important to understand because over the past number of days and weeks as this story has unfolded, there's been a lot of people conflating asylum seekers and refugees. And it's really important to understand that the federal government has existing programs in place that delivers direct support to refugees who are brought here through federal government programs. And we also support organizations who provide services to them through existing programs. When we're dealing with asylum seekers, people who've not come through a program but who arrived in Canada seeking safe haven from violence, war, or persecution, those are not people that were brought in through an official program, but we wanted to have funding available to ensure that they're not left on the street so that vulnerable people can have a roof over their head. Our projections indicate that the $97 million that the City of Toronto can expect after today's announcement is more than enough to cover the interim housing costs for some of the vulnerable asylum seekers who they're dealing with in their shelter system. And of course, we're happy to work with the city to identify those who may have come through refugee programs that might be entitled to other benefits to ensure they're receiving the benefits that we put in place specifically to support them.
Okay, so I don't want to get into a sea of math here, but if it's $97 million to deal with asylum seekers, but there's still an issue with refugee housing, is that another $150 million that the City of Toronto says it needs to deal with that particular aspect of the issue, or are these all sort of lumped together in that global amount?
Well, let me just be a little bit more specific. They are not lumped together, but the additional supports that we provide directly to people who come to Canada as refugees includes 12 months of income support directly to their families. Or in the case of privately sponsored refugees, of course, the sponsorship groups provide equivalent supports. We also fund settlement agencies who help people not only find housing, but potentially provide language training, some provide daycare, and different benefits depending on which organization that you're working with. The challenge here is dealing with people who come into the city or to communities across Canada who don't have access to those benefits but still need a place to live, still need a roof over their head. This particular funding, which is coming through the Interim Housing Authorization Program, is going to make sure that there's funding in place to help support this vulnerable population. But going forward, after the end of this fiscal year, we would expect to improve the governance structure as between levels of government and build these costs into the ordinary housing asks that come from different municipalities across Canada so we can plan to support people who arrive rather than every time we have an influx of people who may be seeking safe haven, doing this dance again year over year. This is something that we're going to do based on the exceptional nature of the situation that's unfolding now, but we want to improve things permanently going forward by landing on a new model that will allow us to build these costs into the ordinary partnerships that are supported by all levels of government through the housing programs that we've established not only federally, but of course at the provincial and municipal levels as well.
Okay, because that's kind of where I wanted to go next, because this is one-time money that you're putting on the table here now, sort of an emergency surge, but this could be a persistent thing, as you've said. So are you going to look at an increase in the long-term funding for this, or does a new program be developed? How do you deal with this if it continues year over year?
So in the short term, we need to continue to provide essentially emergency funding on an interim basis. But in the long term, when we're dealing with people who showed up because they needed protection but didn't know where to go, that's something that should engage responsibilities of all levels of government. This is something that puts pressure on the housing supply and the shelter system in communities across the country. And the correct way to deal with this is to build these conversations into negotiations we have around support for housing and shelter capacity more broadly. I would suggest that the National Housing Strategy would be a great place to look if we're going to look for additional support to help expand the stock or supply of shelter capacity or houses in a particular jurisdiction. So after this fiscal year, when we exhaust the funds that we're now putting on the table to help solve the immediate challenge, I think we need to revisit this conversation and account for people who might be vulnerable but don't qualify for existing refugee programs in the ordinary conversations we have around housing policy and investments that the federal government can support in partnership with other levels of government who certainly bear some responsibility to help vulnerable people as well.
Right, so you want to see more money from large-scale municipalities, you want to see more money from provinces to help deal with all of this. It's not just a federal problem to solve. Is that a correct interpretation of what you just said?
That's absolutely true. The reality is Canadians expect everyone, regardless of which level of government, to ensure that vulnerable people are not left on the streets in our communities. I want to give a huge thank you, by the way, to some of my colleagues who represent the City of Toronto, who've been excellent to defend the interests of vulnerable people, who've been excellent to advocate for us to partner with other levels of government. But your characterization of my response is accurate. This is something that should engage every level of government. It's a concern for Canadians, and I think we all have some responsibility to help ensure vulnerable people are supported in our communities.
Okay, I want to touch on something else here, because we have this, obviously, this acute housing issue that in the short term that's happening in Toronto, but you hear in other cities, in Calgary, there's issues there in terms of renewal of contracts for people who supply supports for refugees and for asylum seekers in there, and they're dealing with the knock-on effects of secondary migration. People who have gone to Toronto initially, but then headed out west because of the housing challenges and stuff there. There's a shortage of cash there. Are you making moves as a department to deal with that, or to accelerate the renewal of contracts in some of the service providers in places like Calgary?
So thank you, and look, you'll appreciate the nuance to an answer may not be great for television, but the situation in one community might not be identical to a situation in another community, and we want to make sure that the decisions we take reflect the realities on the ground. So in addition to the $97 million for interim housing for asylum seekers that's going to be going to Toronto, we should acknowledge this is a $212 million national fund that's going to help communities who are feeling an acute impact for similar reasons. But over and above that support, there's different programs that we put in place. Some of them support refugees and their families directly, such as income support, but others come through settlement service providers. The issue of secondary migration is actually a very challenging one to sort out, because we don't necessarily track which community a person moves to. We don't monitor people every day once they arrive in Canada safely and become a refugee and are pursuing permanent residency or citizenship. And I have heard from service providers that when people land in a particular community and move to another, our funding formula puts money in the organizations where people land originally. Right. That's something that I want to work to better understand, so we can ensure that we're actually delivering support to the people who are providing the service, regardless of where their clients may have landed initially.
Minister, we just received a statement from Olivia Chow, the new mayor of Toronto, saying that while we appreciate today's announcement, it will not meet the needs of refugees arriving in Toronto and across the region. It may provide a short-term stopgap, but she says she's working with the city manager and senior staff to determine what they can do immediately, and we'll meeting with higher orders of government to talk about space and personnel, but saying it will not meet the needs of people arriving in Toronto. What's your reaction to the mayor's statement there?
We are basing the funding amounts on the information that we're receiving from the city and the projections that we have going forward for the number of asylum claimants who may find themselves in the city. One of the things that I sincerely hope the City of Toronto and other communities who've been impacted understand is there is a very real difference for programmatic support for refugees who are brought here through government programs where we made a decision that we're going to bring someone to safety in Canada and support them. There's a big difference between those people and those who arrive seeking asylum, who came because they were forced to flee, but were not coming through any official government program. The Interim Housing Authorization Program is designed to support those asylum seekers for whom there is no support. To the extent that the mayor's comments are that this won't solve the challenges for refugees, which are a different category of vulnerable people who also deserve our support, I would point out the fact that we have hundreds of millions of dollars annually who are going to support these people now, including in the City of Toronto. So if we want to work on supports for refugee communities through the programs that we put in place to support them, we're happy to do that with the City of Toronto. But when it comes to the support for the housing pressures that they're facing for asylum seekers, the funding that we have should be more than enough to cover the interim housing costs. If they're conflating refugees and asylum seekers for whatever reason, then I would understand her perspective. But if they are actually talking about the asylum claimants who this program is designed to support, there should be more than enough support from the federal government to provide the shelter capacity or housing opportunities that people need based on the projections and information we're receiving from the city and the trends that we're monitoring insofar as we expect people to arrive in Canada in search of safety.
Okay. Immigration Minister Sean Fraser, thanks for your time.
A pleasure as always. Thank you so much for having me.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford weighed in on this and says more assistance is needed for refugees and asylum seekers.
Shelter's number one, working permits are number two. And so I'm going to be all over the federal government to make sure that they get these people back on their feet. You can't just drop people and say, okay, we're all done. It doesn't work that way. We need to work collaboratively all together.
For more on this, we've reached two people who work with newcomers. Debbie Douglas is the Executive Director of the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants and joins us from Toronto. And in Calgary, Kelly Ernst, Chief Program Officer for the Centre for Newcomers in Calgary. I'd like to thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Debbie, I'd like to start with you, just because so much of the focus today is on Toronto. Sean Fraser says the $97 million should help deal with the asylum housing issue. Olivia Chow says there's still not enough to deal with the refugee issue. Where does this leave Toronto right now?
In a very difficult place. We are hoping that with the $97 million, it was good to see the federal government and the IRCC minister step up and announce the $97 million. But I have to agree with the city. $97 million isn't enough. Toronto has been in the hole. One of the things that the minister is forgetting, that the city stepped up and opened up a hotel for the Ukrainian arrivals, many who came to Toronto even before the federal government decided to open up their own 2-week stay hotel. So some of the dollars that would have gone to our shelters, including our refugee stream shelters, have been used up in terms of hotels for an unexpected population, and rightfully so, right? And that's what we're saying. The federal government has a responsibility. I understand the difference that the minister is making. There is a difference in our immigration program between refugee claimants, asylum seekers, same thing, and refugees who come in as permanent residents, government assisted or privately sponsored, as the minister talked about. But what we're arguing is that it doesn't remove the responsibility, jurisdiction issues aside. Yes, the province is responsible for housing and employment and health and those kinds of things. But when it comes to people who are seeking protection in Canada, the federal government has an enduring role to play. And what we're asking them to do is to step up and really support what is needed in Toronto, so that we don't have people who are arriving in Canada indicating that they plan to claim asylum, and having Canada Border Service Agency send them to downtown Toronto, expecting them to be accepted and referred into a shelter when in fact there are no shelter spaces.
So if the minister, just interrupt you for 1 second, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if the minister is correct that the $97 million could handle the asylum challenge, what's the gap on the refugee side? Because as you mentioned,
but I'm not agreeing. I'm not agreeing actually with the minister that the $97 million will handle the refugee claimants issue. Our refugee claimants shelters are at a peak. And we have refugee claimants on the streets. If the minister is suggesting that the $97 million should be used to clear out the shelters, both in the general population where there are refugees as well as the refugee-specific shelters, those people will move into housing, and the refugees the refugee claimants on the streets will then move into those spaces. He is forgetting the housing crunch, the affordable housing crunch we're having here in the city. What we need is expanded shelter spaces, while community workers continue to try and work to find landlords who will be able to rent at a rate that folks who are in the shelter, refugee claimants, asylum seekers, some refugees who came through our government-assisted programs because of income, because of not enough income, are finding themselves homeless. So there are issues there as well. So the government, all levels of government has a role to play. The federal government has put $97 million on the table. I'm hoping the province of Ontario will also step up, but the federal government really does need to do more in the city of Toronto.
Okay, Kelly, if I can bring you in here, I read some reporting by my colleague Kelly Kreiderman this week in the Globe and Mail about challenges with processing times and service delivery programs for refugees in Calgary. I don't think there's any money here today to deal with that particular thing. What's your sense on this announcement, how it might affect the situation in your city?
Well, keep in mind that Toronto isn't different than what's going on here in Calgary as well. There's a similar problem going on here. So hopefully some of that money is filtered toward other parts of the country as well. There's a whole host of different issues, though, that I think Minister Fraser touched upon that needs to be addressed. And a full-scale sort of policy review really needs to occur more at a global level. So the differentiation between, refugees and asylum seekers and who gets what is wrong-minded in my mind, and has been for years. It creates disparity on a whole range of different levels. And certainly here in our city, asylum seekers are not eligible for any services whatsoever. So when they need language classes to learn English, to help start their route to support themselves and sustain themselves, they can't get it. And here in our city, as you pointed out, the wait times are so excessive. To get into language classes in Calgary, you're looking at a 6-month wait, and you're in line with thousands of people. Our organization served more than 35,000 people last year. In the first quarter of our fiscal year this year, we're estimating that we will far surpass that in this coming year. Yet we are working under a contract that was made 4 years ago at levels that were 10 times below what we're seeing now.
Right.
So we're getting funded for working at a level that is almost 10 times below the levels of immigration that we're seeing in Calgary right now. So there's a lot more complex issues that we need to address, and segmenting out everything in terms of people's statuses and only looking at one particular issue, in this case housing, I think is wrong-minded.
So so Kelly, just on that point though, the funding you have and the resources you have to deal with the problem hasn't scaled anywhere close to the scale of the problem, the way it's escalated.
It was for a while, but that has ended as of this federal budget. So one of the things Minister Fraser pointed out is they have trouble monitoring secondary migration. Their own numbers, they can look into the organizational numbers that we all have to submit, and they can see where that secondary migration is going. And they can see that, what's going on with our particular organization and within the city. The secondary migration here is absolutely massive. So there is a method to actually monitor that, but we have to have policymakers, pay attention to that and follow that. But as I said, once you do that, then you have to really look at the full-scale policy environment and what really is needed, not only in one city of the country, but throughout the whole country and throughout whole regions. So what's going on in Toronto, we can't forget, is also going on in other cities across the country. I was in Edmonton this weekend, around the Bissell Center, and it's really, really clear that newcomers are needing support because they're on the street in Edmonton. They're on the street in Calgary around the drop-in center. We have to decide from a policy perspective what kind of country we would really like. There's nothing wrong with having 500,000 people come here every year to help this country be a great place to live. But then we have to put in the investment in the infrastructure and an investment in the settlement services and language services and all of the other pieces of the puzzle that ensure that people can be self-supporting and don't ever need to go to a shelter. So we need to think, as I said, in a different way about this whole issue.
Okay, Debbie, I've only got about 30 seconds left, and I apologize for rushing you with a question like this. But if this money isn't enough to deal with the acute situation in Toronto throughout the rest of the summer, what will the streets of Toronto look like in the coming weeks and months? Will it still be these images we've seen of people sleeping on the streets in the rain?
We hope not. I'm hoping what the city will do is to put this $97 million towards a reception center with expanded shelter support for refugee claimants. While the political fight continues to have the other two levels of government step up with more funding. We cannot afford to have people sleeping on the streets. And this is not only for refugee claimants, but this is for all folks who are finding themselves homeless. We need a really serious investment in terms of affordable housing, deeply affordable housing. We're in get to income kinds of housing. We need a range of mixed housing. But in the short term, we need shelters and shelter spaces where refugee claimants and others can become stabilized, where they can begin to get the kinds of services that Kelly talked about that they require in the case of refugee claimants, particularly legal services, so that they can begin their claim process, which will then lead to having a work permit, being able to access some income support while it is that they go on. I was so glad, the last thing, I was so glad to hear the minister say that he's open to looking at a new program and a new approach to refugee claimants. I suggest that we look at building a program that replicates the RAP program that's done for government assisted refugees. Supports built in with community-based organizations, with income support for at least a year, so people can stabilize, get the language training that they need, get the employment supports that they need, find permanent, adequate housing for their families, and be able to begin to contribute to Canadian society.
Okay, we could do this conversation for an hour, but I got to leave it there. I got to pay some bills. Thank you so much to Debbie Douglas Kelly, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.